All right, welcome everyone to this presentation on how you go about identifying aquatic plants. So really this is just an introductory lecture on that, recognizing that it can take weeks, months, or even years to become proficient at identifying even a small number of aquatic plants. But the hope is that this presentation will get that process started for you. So my approach here is I'm going to highlight the key anatomical features of aquatic plants that are useful in identifying them. There's a whole diverse array of plant anatomy that you can look at when you are trying to identify a plant. I'm going to pull out what I'm calling the key anatomical features that will help you narrow down the species of plant. The second objective then is from there I'm going to spend some time going over the identification of some of the regionally important invasive plants. So we hope that that'll strengthen your ability to recognize some of these invasive plants, and we're gonna work on strengthening your ability to identify them by using the key anatomical features that I'm going to go over during the first part of this lecture. So in this slide, we're looking at 7 anatomical features, and this is what I'm calling the key anatomical features. These are the anatomy of the plant that you really want to pay attention to when you're trying to identify it. And it's not necessary to address all of these features when you're trying to identify a plant. In fact, you may only need to look at 1 or 2 features. But we're going to go through each of these 7, ranging first of all from just where the plant's growing to differences in its leaf arrangement, in architecture or shape or the type of venation. So the first key anatomical feature isn't really so much anatomy. It's more of where is the plant growing, because depending on where plants are growing, whether they're submerged underwater or they're emerging out of the water, their anatomy will be a little bit different. So first try to think about where the plant's growing, and even if you don't find a plant growing in its natural habitat, maybe you find it on a boat prop, there's still some really important clues as to where that plant came from. So when we think about where plants are growing, we basically can break that down into 3 different areas. The first one we call emergent plants, and these are plants that grow up and out of the water for the majority of their growing season. So the bulk of their photosynthetic material is, in fact, it's not underwater, it's up above the water. So we can often tell if it's an emergent plant even if you don't find it growing somewhere, because emergent plants tend to have a really thick waxy cuticle on the leaf, and what that does is it prevents the leaf from drying out when it's exposed to all that intense sunlight up above the surface of the water. Another important feature of emergent plants is that the leaves, and particularly the stems, are very rigid, and when you break them open you can see that they're comprised of this spongy tissue called parenchyma tissue, which is plant tissue that has these really large air spaces in it that helps the plant stay buoyant and float up above the surface of the water. Another type of growing condition for plants are what we call floating leaf plants, and these are where they're plants that have leaves floating at the surface of the water. Now they can be still attached to the bottom and they can still have underwater vegetation, but the bulk of the photosynthetic material is floating on the surface of the water. And here's 2 common examples on this slide. On the left is duckweed, and this is an example of a floating leaf plant that's not attached to the benthos in any ways, completely floating. And on the right is water shield, a really common floating leaf plant around here. And this plant, actually the leaf is attached down to the substrate underneath the water with a petting. So floating leaf plants, you can tell if it's a floating leaf plant because just like emergent plants, they tend to have a tough and leathery, waxy cuticle. Also, the leaves tend to be circular or elliptical with smooth margins. And one of the reasons for this is it's probably an adaptation so that when the wind blows across the water, it doesn't tear the leaves apart. If there was lots of sinuses and it was a compound leaf, then it would likely get ripped apart on the surface of the water. Another characteristic is if there's a stem under the leaf, it usually has a lot of elasticity to it, it's stretchy, or it has a lot of slack in it. And that helps for two reasons. One is if the water level changes, the elastic petiole can compensate for that, or when the wind blows the leaf around, there's plenty of mobility in the leaf. And then the final one we're going to talk about in terms of where plants are growing is a submerged plant. So a submerged plant is one where the majority of the biomass is below the surface. Now, even submerged plants sometimes, or quite often actually, will have floating leaves. Now, those floating leaves are usually associated with the flower, but below the surface is where the majority of the plant's biomass is. So here's two examples on this slide. On the left is a very common plant around here called eelgrass. You can see some of the leaves actually hit the surface, but the bulk is below the surface. And on the right is perfoliate pondweed. Again, another example of primarily a submerged plant, but you will sometimes see very small floating leaves associated with the flower. Now, submerged plants have a lot of different features. First of all, that thick cuticle that we talked about before, submerged plants do not have that. In fact, their leaves tend to be really flexible and kind of dainty, and that's an adaptation for decreased resistance to water movement. The leaves are very soft and they kind of go with the flow. Whereas if they had a thick cuticle, they might get torn up with underwater currents. All right, so let's get into number 2, the second key anatomical feature, and that is whether or not the plant has a petiole. So a petiole is the botanical term for a leaf stem. So we say a plant is petiolate if the leaf has a stem that connects it to the main branch of the plant. So on the very left-hand side here, this picture, these leaves of this pondweed are attached to the main stem by what's called a leaf stem or a petiole. So we would call this a petiolate plant. Many aquatic plants do not have a petiole, and if there's no petiole, we say the leaves are sessile, which means there's no petiole present. So in this case, the leaf emerges directly out of the stem. This center picture is another species of pondweed, and as you can see, the leaf connects directly to the main branch without a petiole. Number 3 is a very, very important anatomical feature that's called leaf arrangement. Right? So we're going to look at how leaves are arranged on the stem. Before we get into that, I just want to introduce you to another botanical term that's called a node. A node is a special kind of plant tissue that has the ability to give rise to either new leaves, new shoots, new stems, or new buds. So that type of tissue can only grow out of a node. All right? So in alternate arrangement, one leaf arises from each node. So each node only produces one leaf. But as you go up on the stem, the next node up, the leaf alternates to the other side. So look at this picture on the right of perfoliate pondweed. This is a classic example of alternate arrangement. Every place that you see a leaf in this picture, there's a node that has given rise to that leaf. But only one leaf comes out of the node. And as you go up the stem, that leaf alternates from side to side. So that's alternate arrangement. The next type of arrangement is opposite arrangement. This is where two leaves arise out of each node. And those leaves are opposite from each other on the stem. So in this example, you can see right in the center where the red arrows are is the node, and there's two leaves that come out of that node. So that's opposite arrangement. The third type of leaf arrangement is called whorled. And whorled arrangement occurs when there's 3 or more leaves that arise out of each node. And they're all positioned around the stem. So the picture on the right is a picture of coontail. And all those tiny leaflets are coming out of one single node. There's 3 or more leaves coming out of the node, and they whirl around the stem. The last type of leaf arrangement is called basal arrangement. This is when the node is very low on the plant and all the leaves emerge as a cluster from the bottom of the plant. That's basal arrangement, from the base. Okay, the fourth anatomical feature is the architecture of the leaf blade. And what I mean by that is it's simply how is the leaf built in space. So for example, the first example of leaf architecture is what we call a simple leaf. And that's the picture on the upper right. A simple leaf is an undivided blade. So notice on this leaf right here, there's no sinuses. The leaf isn't divided or fragmented in any way. It just has one single undivided blade. That's called a simple leaf. On the other end of that spectrum down here, on the bottom right, is a compound leaf. A compound leaf is a fragmented blade. So everything inside this red polygon here, that's basically the milfoil leaf. But one single leaf is fragmented into all these little tiny spines, little tiny leaflets. That would be an example of a highly compound leaf. Number 5 is the edge of the leaf blade. So often plants will have some sort of unique signature on the edges of their leaf. So take a close look at the edge of the leaf blade for any indication of what species it might be. So some terminology to go along with the edge of the blade. So the upper right-hand picture shows a leaf blade that we would say is entire. That means the leaf is smooth margin. There's nothing at all going on the edges. It's nice and smooth. That's an entire leaf. On the bottom right is an example of a sinuate leaf. So notice on the lower right-hand corner, the edges of that leaf blade are really kind of wavy or wrinkly. So the term to describe that is sinuate. A sinuate leaf is a leaf that has lots of little curves and waves on the edges. Some other terms related to the edge would be dentate. A dentate leaf means it has lots of little teeth on the margin. So dentate means teeth, like dentist. So this picture on the upper right, you can see where that black arrow is. It's pointing to all the little saw blade teeth on the edge of that leaf. Okay, and the bottom then is an example of an edge that we would say is lobed. A lobed leaf means it's partially divided, and the edge of the leaf has a sinus in it where it being cut into. Number 6 then is the shape of the leaf blade. So we can look at a plant and get a feel for the overall shape of the leaf, and all the different types of shapes you see when you look at plant leaves, they all have botanical names. We're only going to go over a few of them. These are ones that we commonly see in aquatic plants. So the first one is called elliptical. An elliptical leaf is one that is an oval, and imagine you took the ends of the oval and just pulled them out a little bit. It's a stretched out oval. So the picture on the upper right shows elliptical leaves, and that is a Brassinia, also called water shield, because the leaves take a shield-shaped look, which means elliptical. On the bottom right is an example of another type of shape called lanceolate. Lanceolate leaf, just like the Renaissance era weapon, a lance. A lanceolate leaf is one that gradually extends at the base and widens out, sort of like the hilt on a lance, and then gets narrower and narrower and more pointed towards the apex of the leaf. That's what's called a lanceolate leaf. Some other words to describe the shape. On the left-hand side is cordate. Cordate is a botanical term that means heart-shaped, like we see in this nufar on the left. Or on the right is Vallisneria or eelgrass. That leaf is what we call linear. A linear leaf is like a strap or like a shoelace, where it's several times longer than it is wide. Then the last anatomical feature we're going to go over deals with the venation of the leaf. So looking at how the veins on the leaf, the transport vessels, take on certain types of direction or shape. So the first botanical term to describe venation is called parallel. So parallel veins are when the veins on the leaf all run parallel to each other. At least the primary, most obvious veins on the leaf all run parallel. And here's a really good example in this picture of a pondweed where you can see all of the major veins are all running the long axis of the leaf, and they're all parallel to each other. Here's some examples of some other terms to describe venation. Palmate is when all the veins emerge from a central point and radiate out. So here's white water lily, and you can see on this picture all the primary veination emerges from this central point and radiates out, kind of like the way your fingers radiate from the palm of your hand. So that's palmate. On this picture on the right of spatterdock, this is pinnate. Pinnate means the veins are arranged along two sides of a central midvein. So in this illustration, you see the very prominent central midvein, and then all of the other secondary veins are arranged along two sides of that central midvein. Okay, so we're going to use these anatomical features to recognize some of the regionally important invasive plants, and you'll be getting more information on how to identify these plants in a subsequent lecture presentation. But we're going to give it a try now. We're going to just see how well it works. Now, when you're thinking about identifying aquatic plants, you have to realize that it takes a lot of practice to do this. But your brain is very, very good at taking a very small amount of information and filling it in to create a more larger picture of what you're looking at. So you just have to get used to seeing a couple of these key anatomical features, and it should be as if a light bulb goes off and you can recognize what it is. Even though you may not know anything about the biology of the plant or where it comes from, but you recognize a shape or a pattern when you look at it, and your brain can recognize then what that plant is. Let me give you an example of just how good you are already at doing this. Okay, so here's a question for you. What is this right here? Okay, so I'm sure everyone immediately recognized this as the planet Saturn. So I'm going to go ahead and assume none of you are planetary astronomers. None of you have been to Saturn. None of you probably know the dimensions or what the atmosphere is made out of. So you know very little bit about this planet, but you can immediately recognize it by its key anatomical features or its key characteristics. It's a circle surrounded by a ring. Bam, that's Saturn all day long, and no one would ever argue that with you. So your brain is really good at recognizing these shapes and patterns. Let's try it again. What's this one? Okay, so I'm sure you all immediately recognize this as a dog, but even more than that, you can recognize it as a specific breed of dog, a poodle. So again, just taking a silhouette, you can identify the species as well as the breed when only thing you're looking at is the shape. All right, let's try it again. What's this? Okay, so again, you're so good at this. Your brain is so good at taking a very small amount of information and using it to paint a bigger picture that you can actually identify a species that doesn't exist and has never ever existed on the planet just by looking at a shape. All right, I'll do one more. All right, what's this? So I bet most of you are recognizing this series of polygons as the Hawaiian Islands. So maybe you've never been there, you might not be able to tell me what the name of the largest island is or what the capital of the state is, but you immediately recognize this as Hawaii just because it's a series of small polygons that are running in a northwest direction, and bam, it's Hawaii. So this is how you have to start to operate when it comes to identifying organisms, including aquatic plants. You have to pick up on just a couple key anatomical features or key characteristics that you need to recognize. You don't need to know everything about the plant to identify what it is. All right, so let's put this to practice with some real aquatic plants. I'm only going to go through two invasives, but you'll get more training on this in some of the subsequent material. All right, the first one that's very, very important for everyone in this position to recognize is Eurasian water milfoil. And when you're working with identifying any organism, I really encourage you not to blow off the scientific name. You know, a lot of my students will blow off the scientific name if I'm not going to require that they memorize it. But don't do that. It's really helpful often if you can think about the etymology of these words. They're usually coming from Greek or Latin words that, and these Greek and Latin words mean something that help us recognize the plant. So for Eurasian water milfoil, the scientific name is Myriophyllum spiccatum. So that word myrio, that's a Greek word that means numberless, and philo is a Greek word that means leaf. So numberless leaves. And the picture that paints is that there are so many leaves on this stem that you could never count them. And when you look at milfoil, you can see that it's typically a very bushy plant with lots of leaves. And the reason it looks numberless is because the leaves are compound. Each individual leaf is broken up into small leaflets. The species name is spiccatum, which comes from the Greek word spica, a spike, which refers to the flower spike, which holds both male and female flower parts. All right, so what are the key characteristics to recognize Eurasian water milfoil? One tip I will give you is when you're learning to identify organisms, it's really great to use drawings as opposed to photos. Because in a drawing, the artist can always clearly illustrate the key characteristic, whereas in a photograph, sometimes you can't see those characteristics just because of the nature of the photograph. So we'll use this picture here to go over the key anatomical features to look at for Eurasian water milfoil. First of all, it's submerged. So in this illustration depicts that. The bulk of the photosynthetic material is below the surface of the water. The leaf itself is compound, so it's a divided leaf, and in fact it's deeply divided. They're very finely divided into very small leaflets. What about the leaf arrangement? The leaf arrangement is a whorled arrangement. So there are 4 leaves per whorl. So there's 4 leaves that come out of each node, and those 4 leaves are whorled around the stem. And the reason I have this as being bold-faced here is because that is a really important characteristic to get you to the milfoils. Another characteristic we didn't go over specifically, but it's how the tip of the leaf looks. So for milfoil, the apex or the tip of the leaf is flat. So when you look at this picture down here on the bottom right, see how the tip of the leaf is perfectly flat, like someone took a pair of scissors and just trimmed the leaf? That is a very, very important characteristic to recognize for Eurasian water milfoil. Another characteristic deals with the spike. The flower is on an emergent spike that it's called monoecious, meaning there's both male and female parts. And very often, I see this time and time again, and it is that the actively growing part of a milfoil, Eurasian water milfoil, tends to have a reddish color to it. So here's some more photos of Eurasian water milfoil to point out, again, some of those characteristics. See how the leaf tip is flat, like it's cut with a pair of scissors? You can see it again here. That's a very important characteristic. Another characteristic which can be handy for deciphering it from native milfoils is Eurasian water milfoil has a really large internodal distance, which means the space between each node is relatively large. There's a large space there. So when you pull it out of the water, the leaves tend to lay flat on the stem, like right down here, because there's no other nodes and leaves to help, buoy all the leaves up. So it's not particularly bushy when you pull it out of the water. All right, let's do one more species. This is variable leaf milfoil. So again, it's Myriophyllum, same genus, which means numberless leaf. That's particularly true in this species because it's very, very bushy and thick with leaves. And then the species name is Heterophyllum. So hetero is the Greek word for different, and then philo again for leaf, so different leaves. And this refers to the fact that the emergent spike, where the flowers are, has a very different set of leaves on it than what's underwater. The submersed leaves are very different from the emergent leaves. So here are the characteristics to look for variable leaf milfoil. Again, tied in with a illustration, a drawing, which is really the best way to start learning how to identify any species. So in variable leaf milfoil, again, going through these bullets, it's submerged. It has a compound leaf that's deeply divided, as you can clearly see in this picture. It has a whorled leaf arrangement. In this case, the apex of the leaf is rounded. It's not nice and flat like your Asian water milfoil. This species is very, very robust. It has a very thick stem, and typically whenever I see this species, the stem is not only very robust and thick, but it tends to be anywhere from dark, dark brown all the way to red. There's a lot of color in the stem. And then the real key for identifying it is in the flower, but the flower spike has whorled leaves that look entirely different. They're actually toothed and sort of lanceolate in shape. So here's some photos of variable leaf milfoil. And you can see just how thick and robust it is. Very, very small internodal space. So the space between each node is very small, making the plant appear to be very, very bushy, as you can see in both these pictures here. And here's what I mean about the robust, thick stem. You can see how thick this stem is, and it has a red or often a brown color to it. Okay, so remember, when you're identifying aquatic plants, look at these key anatomical features about where it's growing, the shape of the leaf, whether it has a petiole. These are very important. Also remember is you can usually identify an aquatic plant by just being able to recognize one or maybe two important characteristics. Just when you looked at that silhouette of Saturn. Circle with a ring around it. That's all you needed to know to identify it. And this is true with identifying organisms as well.